welcome everybody to our wonderful webinar today on faithful citizenship and helping young adults become faithful citizens. We are really honored to have all of our attendees with us here today, and they're wonderful speakers that we have. So I'm going to go through a few introductions and let you all know how the afternoon is going to run. What we've done is disabled the chat bar so that you can use the Q&A. So just look at your little the little black panel at either, probably with screen sharing, it's at the top for you all right now, and just pull out that Q&A. And as we keep going, just feel free to type in any questions that come to your mind as our panelists are talking. And we will have time after they both give some introductory remarks. We'll have time for Q&A. And then we hope to have a few more remarks after that, and then open up to Q&A at the end. And we hope to just go for about an hour today. So thank you all so much for joining us this afternoon. This is such a timely topic, and I'm so deeply honored to have our two wonderful speakers, Emily and Leah. Emily Schumacher Novak holds an MA in Systematic Theology from Marquette University with advanced studies in Ignatian spirituality. She worked for 10 years accompanying college students in their lives of faith before coming to the USCCB. Emily now serves as Assistant Director of Education and Outreach in the Department of Justice, Peace, and Human Development at the USCCB, and she lives in DC with her husband and their two boys. Welcome, Emily.
Thank you. I'm so glad to be here.
Thank you so much. We're grateful to have you, and thank you for your time today.
Of course. I always think, because my last name is so long, that then I add this long title to it, because Department of Justice, Peace, and Human Development, Education Outreach, and the USCCB. So when we say it all together, I run out of breath.
I bet. You got to take a breath in between all that. So welcome, Emily. Thank you. And next we have Leah Salinas. She holds an MA in Theology from St. Joseph's College and serves as the Director of Hispanic Ministry for the Archdiocese of Baltimore. In October of 2019, Leah was elected as Vice President of the National Catholic Association of Diocesan Directors in Hispanic Ministry, and she also served as Region 4's co-chair for the Fifth National Encuentro. Welcome, Leah. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for extending the invitation. I'm very happy to share with everyone that's here today. So thank you.
Thank you, Leah. And also please welcome my co-host and facilitator today, Paul Jarzembowski, the fabulous Paul, Assistant Director of Youth and Young Adult Ministries with the USCCB Secretariat of Laity, Marriage, Family Life, and Youth, and is Staff Liaison for the USCCB National Advisory Team on Young Adult Ministry and the National Institute for Ministry with Young Adults. Welcome, my friend Paul.
Thank you, my friend Tracy. And like Emily at the USCCB, I also have a long last name, a long title, a long office name. So basically, in Washington, we believe in just making everything much longer and more complicated than it probably is. But
yeah, wonderful.
That's what we do.
Why not be, as elaborate as we can be with names? So thanks, Paul. Paul's my co-host and co-facilitator. And I am Dr. Tracy Lamont. I am Assistant Professor of Religious Education and Young Adult Ministry at Loyola University, New Orleans, the Institute for Ministry. And I'm also Vice Chair of Resources for the USCCB National Advisory Team on Young Adult Ministry. And then behind the scenes today, we have Michael Horace. Wave, Michael. He is our Vice Chair of Communications for NATYAM, and he also serves as the Director for the St. Meinrad Young Adult Initiative Leadership. Did I say that right? Young Adult Initiative Leadership. Right. Yep, that's right. No, not as long a title, that's why.
Because I'm not in Washington.
Exactly. Oh, phew.
Things get a lot simpler beyond the Beltway.
So welcome everybody, and I'm going to just turn it over to you all. Emily, I think we're going to start with you today and give us our thoughts today on, what it means to form our conscience and ourselves as faithful citizens today in the world as young adults.
Yep, I am unmuted now, which is always helpful. And I, as you said my name, closed my Word document with all of my information in it. So
oh no.
that really fast. It's right here. Yeah, so I'm really excited to be with all of you today and to have the opportunity to share with you about faithful citizenship. One of the things that I really love is this quote from Pope Francis about creating a culture of encounter that we're all called to do. And while the whole quote is beautiful and I would love to read it, I want to make sure that both Leah and I have time to chat about our opportunities today. And so I really want to focus in on that last little bit that says, may you be sowers of hope, builders of bridges, and agents of dialogue and harmony. And when more do we need agents of dialogue and harmony than right now? I think as Catholics, we are called to respond and use those tools of the church, teaching, scripture, and our communities to help us accomplish these very lofty goals that Pope Francis has set for us in the sort of in the tradition of our church. And we have lots of resources to do that, and we're going to talk about a lot of them today. But one of the consistent messages is that we need to form our consciences in an active and ongoing way and respond to the call to participate often in our local communities, advocating for policies that promote human life and dignity on a regular and ongoing basis. So I think it's important to say that this active call to participation is something that everyone can participate in, regardless of your voting eligibility or status. Everyone is called to advocate for and with those who are vulnerable. And so the tools that we have at our disposal to help us to do that I want to talk about today are twofold. One, forming consciences for faithful citizenships, which helps us to be that positive force that Pope Francis refers to in that quote. And second, we're going to talk a little bit about Civilize It, which is an initiative of the bishops to help Catholics become those agents of dialogue, which, as we said, we need now more than ever. All right, let's go to the next one, please. And I want to give you just a quick overview about faithful citizenship, and I'm sure we're going to talk more about this, both as an idea of being a faithful citizen and the document of forming consciences for faithful citizenship call us to see the humanity and the belovedness of our brothers and sisters, those who are not yet born, our actual neighbors, those who we live with in our homes, those we disagree with, those who are immigrants, the elderly, everyone. We are called to see the belovedness of that child of God who has been created and we are called to honor. Our teaching is that we have a special obligation to care for those who are most vulnerable to injustice, those whose voices cannot or will not be heard. And this is born out of our baptism, right? That we believe in our baptism that we are called, that we are in the body of Christ, and that we are to bring with that responsibility to care for the body of Christ here on earth that helps us to bring about the kingdom. So we are called to engage across divisions as well, which is really difficult. So let's go to the next slide and talk a little bit about the best ways that we can to sort of break down those barriers. We know that engaging with folks, having conversation, even when it's difficult, even when it's a little bit scary, is one of those best ways that we can really break down the barriers and reduce our assumptions about one another. And one of the things I think a lot about is like, why is this so hard? These are our brothers and sisters. These are people who are living with us in our communities. But I think it requires us to be honest about being vulnerable about who we are, to be ready and willing to engage with one another. I think a really great example of how powerful this engagement can be is the story of how the Ad Hoc Committee Against Racism, under the great leadership of Bishop Fobb, has been leading listening sessions across the country over the last couple of years. And those listening sessions have told us time and time again that the engagement that happens, that even though difficult stories are shared, that the community grows stronger because we are able to hear from the first person experience of our brothers and sisters and really value that. Second, I want to share with you another quick example of folks who are really engaged in the work of being called to their communities and being engaged in their communities. Thunder Valley CDC is a group of mostly young adults committed to building sustainable communities in a very tough economy on the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation. Those organizers, many of them, like I said, are young adults. They were looking to make a change. And they began by talking with their neighbors, asking what it is that they needed to do in order to improve the quality of life for themselves and their families. And then they got to work, advocating for policies and reallocating funding that would support their work and their communities. And it was a major win. It was amazing work that they were able to engage in. Next, I really want to talk about that idea of ongoing participation. How have you, I wonder, quick question, how have you formed your conscience recently? Is this something that we tend to engage in just every 4 years, which I myself have been guilty of in the past? Or is this something that we're called to do all the time, every year? Yes, in an election year, yes, voting is part of this. And it's part of our call all the time to be engaged, just like those two examples of the Ad Hoc Committee Against Racism and Thunder Valley CDC were showing us of how to be engaged in our communities regularly in ongoing ways. And so I invite you to think about the way that the bishops give several examples of what ongoing participation can look like. Communicating with your Catholic perspective to elected officials is a very important one. Working within political parties, maybe even running for office, being on the school board or the city council, the list goes on. Participation, I love this analogy. If we don't do it in an ongoing way, it's kind of like brushing our teeth. If we brush our teeth only when we go to see the dentist, are we going to have healthy teeth? No. Just similarly, our communities will not be healthy if we're not engaged with them all of the time without our participation. I love this photo. I think it's a really powerful example of how to be engaged in our communities year round. This happened to be at the Catholic Social Ministry Gathering, which happens usually in DC each February. This year, of course, it's virtual, and I invite you to think about the opportunity to join us this year in February, because it will be virtual. So folks who haven't engaged for a while or maybe haven't yet been able to do that, this will be a great opportunity to get some leadership formation and take action on issues that affect life and human dignity. So I think it's a great example. And then I quickly just want to share a couple of the resources that we have put together in order to help people do this kind of formation in their communities. wearesaltandlight.org/CST101 has a series of videos that we've put together, one for each of the 7 principles of Catholic social teaching, which really undergird our whole social teaching and help us to understand how it comes into play with the very real issues in our world today. And then second, we have faithful citizenship videos, which are available on faithfulcitizenship.org. There's 5 videos in total. I think they do a great job of talking about a variety of issues that impact the way that we as Catholics think about the world today. And then last, I want to talk quickly about Civilize It. Civilize It is a new-ish initiative in the last year or so that invites people to reflect on how we as Catholics are committed towards advancing the common good, recognizing that there is a lot more shared interest than it might seem. And the pledge consists of 3 parts: civility, clarity, and compassion. And those are all really important, and we need all 3 of those to be present in our minds right now. So with that, I want to make sure that Leah has a chance to chat, so I will hand over the mic and let her do that, so we'll have questions and answers later, I think.
Perfect. Thank you, Emily. I'm trying. Okay, here we go. Well, thank you all. I'm very excited to be with you all today and excited to have this conversation. As I was preparing for this presentation today, I was thinking about the words of Pope Francis and thinking about the words of the gospel, how we live in a very, very polarized world right now, not just with politics, but it seems with every issue. There is just so much noise out there. How do we form our consciousness? How do we engage in civilized and respectful conversations with those who disagree with us? And I want to point to Romans 14:19, which says, "Make every effort to do what leads to peace and mutual edification." Oftentimes when we disagree with someone, we say, well, let's agree to disagree. And then we harbor all of those resentments and we walk away from conversations. And Jesus did not shy away from difficult conversations. He engaged. He asked questions. He proposed. He didn't shy away from meeting the Samaritan woman, from sitting down with the Pharisees. He called people out, but he engaged in conversations. And I think this is a starting point for us during these difficult moments in the political moment, the environment that we live in. Even when we engage with conversations with dear family members, we may have our parents who have different views of what we believe, close friends that we probably canceled. We live in a culture that just cancels people instead of engaging in fruitful conversation. So I just wanted to share with you some of the things that might be able to serve as you serve others, as young people look for ways to to engage in these important conversations in just some practical ways. Agreeing to disagree with someone doesn't mean that you cancel that person. It means that you agree to respect how that person feels. Just as we form our conscience, and Emily just gave us a lot of really good resources about how to form our thoughts, how to form our consciousness when we go to the polls and before we go to the polls, not just during the presidential elections, but for everything that we do, for the way we live our lives. So rather than agreeing to disagree, let us allow the other person to also have an opinion, just like we do. We want others to respect our own opinions, but are we doing that in charity to the other person who may disagree with us? Another thing that I would want to highlight is we often feel that, you know, we are, that we have the answer, that, you know, the way we think it's the only way, it's my way or the highway. And, you know, when we engage in these difficult conversations, whatever topic it may be, let's stop and listen. We have to practice listening. Many times when someone else is speaking, we're trying to figure out, instead of listening to that person, we're trying to figure out what we're going to respond. And we're failing to hear what the other person is saying. So we may need a minute. We may need to have some time to digest when we engage in those difficult conversations. But let's do that with respect, with charity. My other advice would be when engaging in conversations, whether they're political conversations, whether they're, you know, just difficult conversations that need to be had. When we're called as Christians, we're called as baptized Catholics to be bridge builders. What does it mean to be a bridge builder? It means meeting the other person where they are, finding a common ground. Instead of focusing on those things that divide us, let us concentrate on those things that do unite us, like our faith. You know, nowadays we hear so much of, well, you're a liberal and you're a conservative, and, you know, you're a Democrat and you're a Republican, but we're Catholic. We're called to be Catholic. But this is a universal church that welcomes all. There are some foundational doctrines and things that we cannot compromise on, such as the dignity of every human person. And that dignity, that God-given dignity, are we recognizing in the other person, even that person that disagrees with us? Are we seeing Christ in that person? Enlarge your circle of friends. It is very tempting for all of us to just engage or to have friends or to move in a circle with people that think like us, that have the people that we have, you know, a lot of common things with. But enlarge your circle of friends and be open to what others who look differently from you, who think differently from you, have to say. And come with an open heart, come with an open mind, so that you may be able to engage in a fruitful and respectful conversation. And another thing that I may want to highlight is, before we speak, pray. Let us pray about what that answer is going to be when someone says something that we may disagree with. Oftentimes it's, you know, our mouth and our tongue moves faster than and we haven't had time to process the information. Let us pray. Let us go back to the basics. Let us go back to what the gospel is asking us to do, which is to love one another, regardless of how differently we may see things, even in this, even in this environment where we hear so much noise from everywhere, from the news, from social media, from the TV, from the political ads, all of this polarization. Let us find time, one, to form our consciousness, to form the way we believe. Why do I believe what I believe? Why, why is this topic or this issue so important to me? What am I passionate about? Let us have some time for discernment, and at the same time, discernment in prayer as to how we can treat those who disagree with us.
Thank you both very much. Really, some of your insights were incredibly helpful, because I think there's many of us who are on this conversation are both ministers, but we're also participants as part of the process as well. So not only are we passing along this information to young adults, but we ourselves have to wrestle with this. So thank you, because no matter whether we're talking about ourselves or ourselves as ministers, we're certainly intertwined with all of this. Tracy, what were you thinking?
So many things.
I
You know me
know.
with my notepad.
I know. I got mine too.
It helps me process so much. Thank you both so much for your insights. I had, we in teaching, we always, especially in teaching ministry students online, we're always trying to focus on the way we come across and making sure we use, I language and are turning to wonder when we're in a complex situation and things like that. And, I wonder, Leah and Emily, but maybe Leah, if you might, what would it look like? So the challenge I always hear from my students is when they're engaging in a hard conversation is they're playing by the rules of conversation and the other person is not. So they're trying to offer Christian charity. What do we have recommendations or experiences to draw from to help any young adults or help us help young adults that wind up in these polarizing conversations over election issues or anything else, even when that person is not, your conversation partner is not kind?
Oh, yes. So I think the first thing with that has to be, this is not about winning a conversation. We often engage in conversations and we think that we have to have the last word and our voice needs to be heard. And yes, people's voices need to be heard. So when you're engaging in this conversation, when someone is not letting you speak, is not hearing you, you need to let them speak. Allow them to say what they need to say and listen attentively. Not judging what they're saying. Again, this goes back to what I just said a minute ago. We're often just reacting. We're trying to figure out a way, when that person's speaking and how are we going to clap back? How are we going to respond? And what might be the best way to put that person in his or her place? We're not listening then. And just as we're passionate about certain things, that person is passionate about certain things. So if they're not playing fair, if they're not listening when you speak, if your words are not coming across or if that person is not understanding, then allow that person. That's when you practice what we call in Spanish, pastoral de escucha. You are listening and you are engaging. It doesn't mean that you're toning them out or zoning them out and that you're just, letting that person ramble or go on, but you're showing respect to that person. And you have to acknowledge that that person has something to say. And if the opportunity comes to say, this conversation is very heated right now, let us take a minute and come back. We all have those friends, even family members who vote differently than we do, who think very differently than we do. Do we stop loving them? No. Do we disengage from forming a relationship with them? No. It just means that we have to treat them with respect. And treating them with respect is also respecting the way that they see things.
Yeah, in a way, a lot of it. So, yeah, go ahead, Emily, please.
Sorry, I was just going to add in, I think that was a beautiful response you gave. I think it was totally right on. I also think that when we're engaging in a conversation, especially around civil dialogue, and this is something that when we were developing Civilize It, we did a lot of thinking about, that it's important that if we are in a conversation where there's hateful language or racist language or xenophobic language that's being used, like that's not civil dialogue. It's not safe for people to be in that space if that's something that's attacking them personally. And we want to be sure that we say very clearly that that isn't what we're intending here, right? That civil dialogue, open dialogue is meant to be between two willing partners, people who are willing and ready to, like Leah said, adjust their posture to think about who is it that, what am I attempting to do in this conversation? Am I trying to win, or am I trying to learn more about this other person, this other beloved child of God? And I think, like she said, starting with prayer, like beginning a conversation like that with prayer, I find always is very helpful.
Thank you.
Well,
Those are
one of the
really,
things
really
that-
powerful moments. Yep. Go ahead, Paul.
So one of the things that do come up in these conversations, though, and that we're getting, that I know that many young adults are saying to each other, that even young adults are saying to church leaders back and forth, whether it's in person or more often than not on social media, is, for instance, in relation to this election, if you're Catholic, you can't vote for fill in the blank. And that it becomes, and it's not so much an uncivilized conversation, but it is a very pointed point that comes up a variety of times. Now, Emily, as someone who, you work in the office that assists the bishops in resourcing the church, in being able to unpack faithful citizenship in the direction that they've set for us, maybe I'll start with you. What would you say to that? Like, what would you advise that when that comes up in conversations, either towards us, from us, or as we witness with young adults within our ministries? What are some things for us to consider and maybe even respond to?
That's a great question, and it comes up all the time. You're so right, Paul. So one of the things that I like to do is go back to what the bishops actually say. So in Faithful Citizenship, in paragraph number 7, it says very clearly at the beginning, in this statement, we bishops do not intend to tell Catholics for whom or against whom to vote. And I think that that's really important that the bishops are saying that the purpose of Faithful Citizenship is to help Catholics form their consciences in accordance with God's truth. And that they recognize that the responsibility to make choices in political life rests with each individual and the light of a properly formed conscience. And the participation goes well beyond casting a vote. All of that is directly in Faithful Citizenship. And I think it's really well said. And it's important to come back to that. We might see voter guides that are produced and distributed, but we really encourage Catholics to seek the resources that are authorized by the USCCB or their own bishops or their state Catholic conferences. Those are all really well done resources that take a look at all of the issues that are impacting our lives today and help us to form our conscience. And again, not just for Election Day, although we cannot overstate the importance of participating. That is part of our moral call, but that it is beyond just Election Day. It is constant and ongoing participation.
Thank you, Emily. Thank you for that. We have a series of questions coming up here. So if you wouldn't mind, my dear panelists, I'll read a few of them to you. We have one that says, how do we help? And in some ways we may have answered a few of these, but maybe we'll just make sure we answered them fully. How do we help young adults when they feel frustrated, when they see faith leaders engaging in political discussions that don't resemble gospel teachings? Like engaging in name calling is an example. And I would definitely add to that the conversations that I have been having with young adults are that exact question. The frustration they have with church leaders that don't seem to be representing the gospel in their language about faithful citizenship. So I welcome conversation on that.
So, we often see this type of behavior on social media.
Mm-hmm.
If you know that person, my advice to you is pick up the phone. Don't just respond on their feed. Don't just respond on their wall. Because again, it may have been your response may be taken out of context. And if my advice is, if you know that person, pick up the phone and call that person. And if the issue is so dear to you, then have that conversation, have that difficult conversation. And you're not calling that person to put that person in his or her place or to change that person's mind, but to say, I'm interested in talking to you about this post, or I'm interested in talking to you about this particular issue. And you have to walk away from those conversations knowing that you may not be able to change how that person feels about that issue. And you need to be okay with that. And you need to pray for that person as well. If it's something that's contrary to the faith, then you also have to have that conversation with that person. If it's not, in all things, charity. And I want to quote St. Augustine when he wrote, "In essentials, unity. In non-essentials, diversity. But in all things, charity." And that applies to charity in conversation, charity in respecting how the other person may see things differently than we do.
I agree. I also think that what we're doing here is we're finding ways to love our neighbors better. How is it that we speak truth with love? And we, that sounds simple and trite sometimes, but I think it's really about being rooted in that idea of this human dignity. It exists behind the keyboard too, bots and trolls aside, but like what we're looking for is honoring the human dignity of the person and asking, like Leah said, that question of tell me more about how you think about this. And then speaking the truth that we know to be true with love.
Well, and one of the part of the question that I think that Tracy had offered from the conversations is also, now some of those experiences are coming from people who we are seeing in perhaps a leadership role, or if you're somebody might be somebody in authority at your parish and at your diocese, nationally, international figures who have authority. Obviously, picking up the phone to talk to those who we might know is one thing, but if we have a certain, there's like a, I don't want to say a disparity in relationship there, where they're kind of at more of a, you look up to them, or they're a leader of a community. How do we wrestle with that? How do we help guide people through understanding that, or if they even see people in authority, one person says this and another person in authority says that, which authority is accurate if they're both speaking in an authoritative voice in relation to church? I don't know. How do we wrestle with that? I don't know if either of you want to tackle that one, but that's yeah.
And I almost wonder, to add to that, not to make too many questions right now, but to add to that, we do have a question that says, how is it, because I'm hearing it a little, Paul, in what you're following up with here, is how do we have a document from the bishops that says you can't say who to vote for, but then we have bishops saying not to vote for a certain candidate? So I wonder if that could be part of the response. Is that too much, Paul?
I think that
to try to answer the, try and also answer the attendees. Yeah. So maybe it's a two-part, but I wanted to get in. It overlapped a little bit with a question that we have here.
Yeah.
Leah, feel free to jump in on this one as well. It's a tricky one for sure. But what I would say is what's important is for us to come back to that idea of forming our consciences, right? That this is an ongoing process done in a variety of ways. And we have lots of resources that can help us think about how to form our consciences. Not only the document Forming Our Consciences for Faithful Citizenship, but we have some like short bulletin inserts, some additional reflection pieces, because when we think about forming our consciences, it's really about hearing the voice of God resounding in our hearts. And that's part of the teaching in faithful citizenship, is hearing that voice of God resounding in our hearts. And so we do that by engaging, by thinking about who it is that we're listening to, what are their sort of like, where is it that they're coming from, what kind of authority do they carry, and how do we listen to that? Because we know that we listen to the teachings of the church and the scriptures with a lot of weight. We put a lot of weight on those. And so how do we continue to engage in that? And if something is challenging to us, I think it's a good moment to look at our posture and say, why is that challenging to me? What is it about my conscience that either isn't well formed about this or needs to learn more? And so I think engaging in all of that in a very prayerful way, in a way that connects with our communities, but also really listens to the teaching of the church, I think is important.
I would also add that the document and the resources, none of that is telling us either to vote for one candidate or towards one party. So listening, again, this is where the outside noise comes in. And this is where a lot of it gets confusing, because we have very public leaders say one thing, perhaps people we respect, and then on the other side we have another set of leaders who are telling us no, this is the way to go about it. But again, we are called not to follow the outside noise, but to form ourselves, to find out what are those deep, important issues and things that, that we care about, not only as individuals, but what is our faith asking us to defend? The dignity of every human person from conception to the end of life, to defend, and again, Emily pointed it out, that all of those resources can be found in they are based in Catholic social teaching.
Mm-hmm.
And so again, and I know we get so much, and I get people ask me or send me, messages and say, wait, but so-and-so said this, and then, my pastor's saying one thing. No one can tell you how to vote or who to vote for. That's where you make your own conscience, and that's how you make an informed decision after your reflection.
Your conscience is the most sacred dimension of your interior self in your relationship with God. That's where it comes from, not the, like you said, Leah, not from the outside, and so I think that leads to, we have two really good questions that I'm going to combine, I hope, if our attendees don't mind, because they're both about forming our conscience. So what strategies could we implement to form our conscience? And those of young adults whom we minister with, not just every 4 years during the elections, which I heard you talking about, Emily. And then the second one to that, which I really, whoever wrote this, it says anonymous, speaking to my heart here because I work at a Jesuit university, but can you speak more about the role of discernment in voting, teaching adults the art of discernment, which goes to formation of conscience. And our attendee also said, I think it's a huge tragedy. Oh, I just skipped around. Where did it go? Huge tragedy in the US church that we have the first Jesuit Pope and not taking advantage of Ignatian spirituality and discernment. So of course I'm going to read that out loud because I agree. But so I wonder about the role of, are there some strategies the two of you might offer for forming conscience, the conscience of our young adults? What are some steps we could give them, and what do we teach them about discernment?
I was reading something that Pope Francis said recently, to choose love. Above all things, to choose love. And if that's the starting point for us to engage young people in conversation. We know that young people, we've seen it in the news, we've seen people out on the streets, Blacks and whites and Latinos and Asians coming together. We can come together. So how do we, how do we have these conversations with young people? Start with, first of all, be honest with them and ask them to be honest as well. We have to have honest conversations. And I was having a meeting the other day, and someone honestly said to me, I just don't know how to address racism. I'm a white person, this person said, and I don't know how to talk about that. I don't even know where to start. And as long as we keep it real, as long as we have honest conversations and we ask them to engage in respectful conversation, because again, things can get heated in the moment, in our youth group, in our young adult group, in our book club, things can get very heated. As long as we underline some basic guidelines as to what that conversation is going to look like. Now, forming our consciousness, the best, again, the USCCB has wonderful resources for us to start doing that, to begin having that reflection. We're not going to wait until November 3rd to start deciding, how we're going to vote, or at the local elections as well. Again, this is not just about November 3rd, even though it's an important election year. All of elections are important, but starting at the local level as well. How do we support the dignity of every human person?
Yeah, I think that's right, Leah. Starting and ending with the dignity of every human person, and really every person as a beloved child of God from conception to natural death. That is the belief. I also think a couple of things. One, I dropped in the chat a short little resource about how to start to form our consciences, and that the idea is not that like we do it, we check a box and we're done. conscience formation is lifelong. It is ongoing, just like our lives of faith, right? That we're constantly putting the work in of doing our prayer, of engaging in our prayer life, engaging with our communities, thinking about what it is the church teaches, reading what the church teaches. All of this is ongoing. And like we said, we can't do all of it on November 3rd on election day, and recognizing that national elections are important, and so are all of the things that are going on in our local communities, from our school board to our city councils. A lot of things are happening that we need to advocate for policies that uphold life and human dignity at all levels of government, wherever we find ourselves, whatever powers of influence or circles of influence that we find ourselves within. That's where we need to be working and advocating along those lines. It's consistent all the way across. I also think, Tracy, having done Ignatian spirituality and been engaged in that for a long time, I also appreciate the importance of discernment. And one of the things that I really think about is that deep connection to Christ that Ignatius calls us to, that listening and walking with the life of Jesus in the scriptures, and walking along with him in all of the parables, like Leah mentioned at the beginning, that show us how to engage with our brothers and sisters, and the love that Jesus has for all of us, that Ignatian spirituality is really founded in. And then finding out, how do I take all of the things that God gives us in this world to bring that into my experience and take that to prayer and find out, what is it that God wants me to do with this? How does God want me to respond to my brothers and sisters, knowing that this relationship that I have with Jesus Christ is so important, and it compels me to act outwardly. And so how do I take that and engage with my community around those things? And knowing that we all have gifts and talents. We are all created with unique gifts and talents and challenges that God has given to us. And so how do we utilize those gifts and talents for the greater good of our communities and our brothers and sisters, and really looking at all of that as part of the equation, I think. So it's not simple. Just like being a Catholic is not easy or simple. The gospel calls us to more.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that is what I always come back to when I think about how to form consciences. I think seeking prudent advice, thinking about the authoritative teaching of the church, the gifts of the Spirit, the examination of conscience, all of these things are important tools that we can come back to time and time again, right? That it's not just one day that we do it, but we do it. And our answers might change over time because we learn more and we deepen in our experience and we get closer and closer to God, hopefully, right?
And
I'm listening to you both, and I'm thinking to myself, really, this isn't a political conversation. It's a discernment conversation.
Yes.
It's a
Yes.
I mean, that's ultimately, it just so happens that the topic of the time is social issues. The topic of the time are things that relate to our political realities. I mean, in a sense, the discernment aspect is something that should be essential. Emily, for those of you who know, who've been on all the webinars with me, you know that one webinar cannot go by without me at least mentioning Christus Vivit at least once. And in it, and I'm going to drop this into the chat right here, because why not? Pope Francis near the end of Christus Vivit says that very thing, talks about the importance of the formation of conscience, which allows discernment to grow in depth in the fidelity to God. It's the work of a lifetime.
Mm-hmm.
And in youth and young adult ministries, and especially with young adults, that is one of the essential components to our work, is helping young adults discern about everything, about their vocation, about the choices they make in life, about the decisions, and yes, about politics. So I think it all comes back down to, that is what we as ministry leaders with working with young adults are called to do, is to train people to do discernment. The political sphere just happens to be like one area of that discernment. But one of the other questions that has come up in the chat that, so I just wanted to say how that, your thoughts just made me think about Christus Vivit, and I just appreciate the discernment kind of push in this. But one of the questions that did come up related to, and there are two different questions, but I'm going to kind of combine them as well. One related to the young adults themselves. There are some young adults who have kind of disengaged from church. There are some young adults who have disengaged from, they're just like, I'm done with politics. They don't want to get involved with this stuff. There's some young adults who want to be involved with church, but they don't have a community that they can, there isn't something in their local community or whatever, so they can't connect. So what can we as ministers do for those young adults who somewhat have disconnected, either by choice or by the fact that there isn't anything around, they can't find a way to connect in, or people who just want to just detach from institutional politics altogether and don't want to have these conversations. How do we engage young adults in that sphere? There's a couple questions that came up about it. So I think I'm just kind of putting it all together because there's a lot of disconnection either by choice or not. And how do we still engage as ministers in these conversations with those individuals as well? And they might be two different questions, but I just thought I'd throw them both at you, and I leave it to either one of you if you wanted to tackle it.
So Pope Francis, and you're right, Paul, calls us in Christus Vivit, and in the process of the Quinto Encuentro, we've been asked to be a church that goes forth. If we're waiting people to come knocking at our programs, at our churches, we're gonna be waiting a very long time. That's not where you're gonna find young adults, and we all know that, right? We have friends who have disengaged. We have friends and family members who no longer practice their faith, but that doesn't mean that they're bad people. It doesn't mean that they don't care about faith. It means that they are at a point in their faith journey where they are disengaged from the church. We may be those agents to be Christ for them. We may be that person, that image. We may be able to bring the good news to them, not by preaching to them, but by they observing the way we live our lives. So we have to practice what we preach, not just talk about our faith. We have to live out our faith so that what others may see in us, there's always those people, usually there's your mentors, your people that you admire, that you say, that person has something that I want, that I admire, that I like, and I wish I had that particular, that thing that person has that calls me to be a better person, that calls me to be a better Christian. So how are we modeling that to other young adults who may not be sitting at the pews or coming to theology on tap? Find that thing that you have in common with that person and engage them, not to be preachy with them, but to see where they are. There was a study done a few years ago, and I don't remember who, Cara or St. Mary's, I don't remember which one, but it identified that a large number of young adults nowadays don't want to be engaged in the church or don't want to come to services, but they care about social justice issues. They care about the dignity of the human person. They care about the issue of racism, all of these issues that are, front and center right now. So again, how do we engage in conversations with them? Well, we have to meet them where they are.
I think that's a wonderful point, Leah. And to me, that means knowing deeply who your young adults are and ensuring that not only you are mentoring them, but that you have other folks that you can draw on from your faith community that can be mentors to them, that can really meet young adults, a young adult who is really, really maybe does want to win a conversation, really doesn't want to have these conversations. It really takes some one-on-one, even maybe small groups, small Christian communities, small groups of faith sharing of like 3 or 4 to really just hash out, hey, I had a conversation with my parents, it went badly, or I had, what support do our young adults need right now to have these conversations, and then discern with them, because we do discern in community, so we discern in the interior of our hearts with God, but God also speaks to us through our relationships with others, and the quality of those relationships are what's so important today. So I really appreciate that. We have a really good question. We're getting close to time here, but Kevin has a question here that I really want to bring forward because I think it's a really practical way to help our ministry leaders here move forward with this topic with their young adults right now. He said the church, and he means the building, not as the people of God, but the actual building. Is the church an appropriate space to have a political conversation? Or maybe you could speak to any best practices or absolute, you can't do this when hosting a conversation, meeting, or event about politics and policies. Like, for example, can a parish host a debate or a panel between candidates? What could we do without jeopardizing our nonprofit church status or credibility of endorsing one candidate over another or a policy over another? So is there anything we could say that, like the legalities of this, I suppose?
I think that's a really important question, and I appreciate you raising it, Tracy, and Kevin, who put it in the chat. First, I would say make sure if you're gonna engage in something like this, to be sure that you're in conversation with the folks at your diocesan office. There's often people there who are able to help illuminate the policies and talk about that. We also on the usccb.org have some do's and don'ts, which are some very sort of basic things. But what I want to come back to is sort of the outlook. The idea is not that we are not engaging in political conversations. Those are important, but we aren't allowed, or it's not good for us to engage in partisan conversations. So I think there's a difference between partisan conversations and political conversations. Being engaged in how our policies are applied that affect life and human dignity in our lives is really important for Catholics to be advocating and having conversations about, and thinking about how do we discern who it is that we are going to vote for, how it is that we are going to help apply these principles, and sort of no matter what happens, knowing that we bring the best of our Catholic tradition to whatever elected official is before us, and knowing that we have a responsibility to sort of raise our voices in that moment. I do think it's important for us to recognize that there needs to be space for us to talk about those principles of social doctrine in the Catholic Church, to analyze our positions and the proposals of candidates, and to carefully think about what our motivations are in voting for these for the candidates that we are considering. I think it's important for us also to go back to the document and think about there are two duties that we have, one positive and one negative, that we must reject intrinsically evil actions, and we also must, one positive and one negative, opposition to intrinsically evil acts and doing good at the same time. We are called to be opposed to evil and to do good at the same time. So I think that it's important to think about that. I think when we go back to the question about partisanship and making sure that we are not even seen as being on one side or the other, but making sure that we are having a conversation about what it is the issues are and what is it that our Catholic teaching has to teach us about that. And like I said, we have some resources, and I can drop one in the chat as soon as we're done here.
Thank you. Thanks, Emily. I think your note about not having partisan conversations is a very helpful thing, but that we are called to grapple with Catholic social teaching. I mean, we are called to that. You know, it's our baptism calls us into the world, you know, so thank you, Emily. Leah, I welcome any thoughts you might have too, but.
I would do this, I suggest the same thing as Emily. Check with your pastor.
Yeah,
with your diocesan office, and look for those resources. You know, Pope Francis says that Catholics do immerse themselves in politics by offering the best of themselves so that the leaders can govern. So we do engage in politics. What that arena may look like, we're not, again, no, you can't have a conversation telling people which way to vote. You can't do that. That's not what the conversation is going to be about. You can have a discussion about Catholic social teaching and Catholic doctrine and what the church teaches about the dignity of the human person. And I saw another question on the Q&A. Someone's asked that we acknowledge that there is a campaign to get Latinos, young Latinos, to register to vote, and that's the hashtag every 30 seconds campaign. So I just want to make a mention to that. And it's a national campaign organized by Catholics to register young Latinos to vote. And the hashtag, the every 30 seconds, is based on the Pew's statistic that every year 800,000 Latinos turn 18, and that equates to roughly about one every 30 seconds. I'm going to post on the chat the hashtag. They have social media. I don't think they have a website, but they have they're active on Facebook and Instagram. I just wanted to acknowledge that as someone mentioned it. And it's not a political campaign. It is not a question about telling Latinos which way to vote. It's asking people, you know, making them aware that they can participate in as faithful citizens. We have rights and responsibilities. And Emily mentioned something at the beginning of the conversation. We need to be the voice of those who don't have a voice, of those who cannot cast a vote because of their status, because of whatever reason that may be. we have a great responsibility to speak for the unborn, for the immigrants, for the refugees, for the elderly, for those who don't have health care. We are called to do that as Christians.
Thank you, Leah. I think I put them in the chat, but double check I've got them spelled right.
Perfect.
And thank you, Yasmin, for that. I think she's the one that posted that.
We definitely had a whirlwind conversation, and there's even some comments in the chat in the Q&A that even offer more comments than they do the questions. So feel free, as you're kind of perusing in the next few moments, in this webinar, to look through some of those comments. But I think that there is a lot of wisdom in each other and in our our collective conversation. I think we wrestle with wanting to have the civilized conversations, but then at this other time, we certainly want to be active and involved and make our voice heard in the political sphere. And it's always this balancing act of when to make it about a conversation about discernment, but when also to be a prophetic voice. There's that tension. And I think that part of it is you've spoken to the fact that we have to kind of be conscious of the tension, and we have to kind of live in that space. It's uneasy. There's not an easy, like, well, just do this and you should be fine. Even when it comes to what your church is allowed to do in an election campaign, well, it depends what the manner of your program is, what you're trying to do. It's not you can do this or you can't. It's not black and white. There is this you have to kind of look at where our circumstances are, where are we coming from. And I think that this is part of and again, we as ministers, in order to help our young adults form consciences for faithful citizenship, we have to form consciousness of how we lead others to form their consciences for faithful citizenship. So discernment goes in all manner. I think we all have to be discerning people. But as kind of our honored guest here, we'd like to invite Emily and Leah, again, if there's any other questions you want to quickly get out there, or any other thoughts you want to say, or any final thoughts that you might have for us. Again, if we're unsettled at the end of this and feeling like we haven't answered everything, maybe that's a good thing, because this conversation is continually ongoing. And thank you for the resources, but I allow you to have at least the last word for now, as we continue to go through this process.
So someone was asking on the chat if we have any recommendations of saints for faithful citizenship. You can never go wrong with Saint Augustine, and his methodology of answering and difficult questions, and how to ponder questions, and how to analyze questions, and how to go deep. If you want to go deep, Saint Augustine. If you want a more contemporary saint, and it's not because I'm from El Salvador, but Saint Oscar Romero, who was recently canonized 2 years ago, who fought for social justice and raising up the voices of those who were who were being mistreated and marginalized, calling for the dignity of the human being. So that would be my those two recommendations. And just as some last words, thank you for engaging in these conversations. We know that it's not easy. We're not saying that these are easy conversations to have, by no means. We understand, again, that we're living in a very polarized world, that even amongst our family and among our dear friends, these are difficult conversations to have, but they must be had. But allowing, again, to have respect, to see in that other person, again, what unites us. What do I have in common with someone who may think differently from me? That would be the starting point in finding that common ground and that respect for one another.
Yeah, I agree with Leah both. I'm so grateful for this conversation and that folks are willing to engage so deeply and wrestle with the really difficult topics. And Paul, like you said, if we're leaving the conversation unsettled, I think that's important to pay attention to. I think that emotion and that unsettledness is a good opportunity to form our conscience and sort of think about more deeply about the issues that have poked at us a little bit. I also think that it's really important to think about Catholic social teaching and the long tradition of our Catholic Church that tells us to bring the best of our Catholic tradition to the public square, and that we have a responsibility to do that every day, wherever we are, whatever community we find ourselves in, and to know that we don't have to have all the answers, but we are called to speak the truth of our church and our tradition with love, and to do that in a way that really respects the human dignity and shows that we believe in that human dignity, both from a policy level, but also on an individual level as we relate to one another. So thank you all for your conversation and for the wonderful questions. And I'm just so grateful to have so many ministers in the field doing all this kind of important work.
Thank you so much, Emily and Leah. And I definitely recognize, I think we have like 8 or 9 questions we couldn't get to. It makes us always think like, maybe we should have 2 hours long, but nobody would stay. But I do, you know, as the Vice Chair of Resources for NatYam, I've been reading all of these questions, and I'm definitely sensing that we need to do some more work here on conscience formation in young adult ministry. So I'm wondering if that will be some conversations we'll start hosting next. So those that didn't necessarily, you know, in a noisy world, how do you form your conscience in a noisy world? And another one I thought was really wonderful is, how do we practice resilience when we get overwhelmed and tired of it? Somebody asked the question of those young adults that are just like, I don't want to deal with politics, it's too divisive, you know? So I think those are really good questions to keep grappling with. And how would we respond to that? How do we respond to, you know, if there's a policy that's bringing harm to human life or the environment, do we not do anything? You know, how are we advocates for people if the policy doesn't put my life at stake, but somebody else's life at stake? So I think those are conversations to have really, really intently with our young adults. And so I just thank you both so very much. Paul, if you have final thoughts here, I'm going to move to our announcements, but go ahead, Paul.
Well, you know, this is challenging for all of us. It's you know, I think we've heard the phrase where, you know, Catholics are politically homeless, but at the same time, we have such a rich home in the fullness of our Catholic social teaching that there is so much. Now, you know, different candidates are going to have different perspectives. Different candidates are going to change their perspectives. They're going to, you know, the question is, I think we're left with always is, are we open to having a dialogue with one another, a civil dialogue, so that the issues really become foremost? And I think that as ministry leaders with young adults, that's part of our responsibility. Our responsibility is to help young adults form their consciences for their lives, on political issues, on vocational issues, on moral issues, on social issues. I mean, the list goes on. Part of our work in the midst of all of this, part of the work of young adult ministry is to help accompany young adults on that journey. It's not easy, and sometimes we walk in all different directions on that road to Emmaus, but it's a good journey. So I just want to encourage you all. It may seem like the next couple of weeks will seem very defeating at times. You might be walking in the wrong direction for a while, but trust us, the journey is worth it. And we're so grateful that you're the ones who've been called by God to walk this path in 2020 with our young adults. Yes, you in 2020 are God's witnesses to our young adults, and thank God for that.
COVID, everything. Yes.
So thank you for your work, and know that we're praying for you, because I know it's not easy for many of us to go on that journey. So Tracy, give us a few last things that we can look forward to in a spirit of hope of where we're going next.
Yes, well, thanks, Paul. Our next webinar is, good typo there, October 15. Yeah, sorry about that, friends. Tracy Lamont and her typos, we all know. So it's October 15th. We're going to be hosting a conversation, a webinar on what it looks like to really get ourselves in the spirit of Advent. And I think that that's also going to need to involve more of this conversation, because October is still before November. And so look forward to that. We'll have more information on that. I also wanted to let everybody know the radio silence from the last webinar, that we had an issue with our recording on our young adult webinar on self-care. And so we now currently have all of the videos recorded separately from our 3 panelists, and we are in the work of making that a manageable file size. And so it will be posted probably no later than Monday, Paul, maybe tomorrow, who knows. But I didn't have enough information to send out to everyone that registered for that last month to tell you what we were doing yet. So now I do.
Get it out. We'll
Yeah,
get it out.
now it's out. We now have recordings of our panelists. So I had so many emails asking because they thought it was so wonderful and they wanted to share it with friends. And I was like, nail biter.
And Tracy, it may be with this election cycle, with all that's happening in our world. So the topic was self-care for
Yeah.
the ministry leader. So even if you went to the last webinar,
Yeah.
I think it's worth watching these videos again because we
Yes.
need that self-care, and
Right
we're going to
now.
need it even more and more in the next couple of weeks and months
Yep.
as we
Yep.
make our way through 2020.
Yep.
So
I
so I think
absolutely
it's a
agree.
good thing for us to, it might have been a godsend that we're having the opportunity to give you another resource
Yeah.
of the recording. So it will come out very soon.
Absolutely. And then there's also, for anybody that's curious about it, there's also a webinar coming up on faithful citizenship with the Catholic Climate Covenant. And that's, I think, next week on the 29th. So I just bring that up because it's also, co-sponsored by the USCCB as well. So I want to thank everybody. Thank you, Emily, and thank you, Leah, for your terrific wisdom today and for gracing us with your presence and helping us in ministry with young adults. It is such a challenging topic to navigate. And you both did it with tremendous grace and such wisdom. So I'm so grateful for your time today.
Thank you, Tracy. And I just want to make one last pitch because we do have one additional webinar in Spanish.
Oh, good.
Our Spanish-speaking community it's the partnership between the office, the USCCB Office of Human Development, Justice and Peace Human Development, the National Association of Diocesan Directors of Hispanic Ministry. And that's going to take place October 15th. I put it in the chat, the link to register.
Oh, good.
So we're going to have that important conversation, just very much like we did today, but in Spanish on October 15th.
That's
wonderful. Great. Thank you very much for that.
Excited. It'll be great. Thank you all so much for all of your amazing work.
Thank you.
Great with you.
It's a blessing to be with you all. And for anybody who is curious about the Loyola Institute for Ministry, we have graduate programs in pastoral studies and religious education and a focus area in youth and young adult ministry. So if you're curious about studying theology and practical theology, give me a holler. All right. On behalf of the USCCB National Advisory Team on Young Adult Ministry, we thank you all for joining us and blessings in all of your ministries.